There are foods sitting in my cellar right now that nobody has ever asked me about. Not once, not until lately, when English folks started showing up with worry on their faces about keeping a pantry through hard times. That worry is new to them. It was never new to us. My mother kept what she kept quietly, the way her mother kept it before her, with no name for it. No bucket, no plan written down anywhere, just a crock under the stairs and a rope of onions by the cellar door, passed along hand to hand, and never once explained because nobody outside our own kitchens ever thought to ask. My name is Eliza Yoder. I have 2 children, still small enough to be underfoot most of the day. One of them forever lifting a lid just to see what's under it, and between them and the garden, the root cellar, and the hen house, my hands are full from morning until well past dark. What I know, I learned from my mother's hands, and hers from her own mother before that. None of it came from a book, and none of it was ever meant to impress anyone watching. It was only ever meant to last. I will have folks tell me they have spent good money on one of those big buckets sealed in silver, the kind that promises to feed a family for 25 years if hard times ever come, and ask me, almost embarrassed, whether they have done enough. I never have the heart to tell them the whole truth straight out, so I will tell it to you instead. Plainly, the way I would tell a neighbor leaning over my fence. What is inside those buckets is a loud, expensive answer to a question my own household has been answering quietly for generations without spending a dollar on a name printed across a bag. The powdered eggs come out gray and grainy, no matter how careful you are with the water, and the smell that comes off them when the pouch is first opened is flat and a little plasticky, nothing at all like food ought to smell. The salt sits heavy on the tongue long after the bowl is empty. And more often than not, that bucket sits untouched in the back of a closet after the first try because nobody in the house really wants to eat from it, and you are left wondering whether you bought any peace of mind at all, or only a closet full of food nobody trusts. I would rather tell you the truth and have you trust me than sell you a trick that wastes your time. So let me show you instead what was already sitting in my own kitchen the whole time, waiting to be asked about, never once needing a foil pouch or a company's name to make it work. Apples were the first thing I ever watched my mother preserve with my own eyes, because they were the easiest, and because the smell of them drying filled the whole kitchen in a way that made the work feel less like work, and more like waiting for something good. She would core them, slice them thin, no thicker than a coin, and string the rings on plain thread, hanging that thread across the kitchen near the stove where the warm air moved through it steady day and night until they were ready. Within a handful of days they would go leathery, bendable in your fingers without snapping, and that is how you know they are ready, and not a day before. There's no clock to set for it. You learn it by feel, the way my mother learned it, and the way I am teaching my own children now, whether they realize they are being taught or not. Slice them too thick and the centers mold before the outsides ever finish drying, a small disappointment you only discover once it is too late to fix. Hang them somewhere too damp and they will not dry at all. They will only go soft and brown and disappoint you twice over. Once for the wasted apples and once for the wasted thread. Done right, a few pounds of fall apples cost next to nothing, and my own 2 children go through dried apple the way other children go through candy, reaching up under that thread the same way I once reached up under my mother's. August brings the tomatoes, and with them the one day of the year I dread and look forward to in equal measure, because my mother's kitchen on canning day was hot enough to drive you out onto the porch between batches, sweat running down the back of your neck no matter how early you started. And mine is no different now. All these years later, we scald the tomatoes to loosen the skins, peel them, pack them into jars with a spoonful of lemon juice for insurance, and process them in a boiling water bath, because the heat at that temperature kills off what would otherwise spoil them, And the seal that forms after, that small satisfying pop you hear from the next room as the jars cool, is what keeps anything new from getting back in. The moment you start adding peppers or onions into that jar, though, you have changed the balance of the whole thing, and a water bath is no longer enough on its own to trust. That calls for a pressure canner instead. No shortcut around it, no exception worth the risk. A case of jars and a good garden's worth of tomatoes carries my family through a winter that would otherwise mean a grocery cart full of sauce jars bought again and again. Cucumbers get a different treatment again, vinegar doing the work this time instead of heat, dropping the acidity low enough that nothing spoiling can take hold and multiply. My grandmother had one rule about this. She never once broke in all the years I watched her can, which was that you measured your vinegar by the cup. Never by eye, never by guesswork, because a weak brine, one stretched thin to save a little vinegar at the bottom of the jug, is the most common way a whole batch of home pickles goes wrong on a person. Pack the spears tight with dill and a clove or two of garlic, get that brine right, and a cucumber patch will keep a household in pickles for a season, at less cost than buying one jar a week at the store. Cabbage still feels like a small piece of magic to me, even after doing it every single fall of my adult life. Shred it fine, salt it at the right measure, and pack it down tight under its own brine in a crock, weighted with a clean stone or a plate so it stays fully under and never exposed to open air. The salt pulls the water straight out of the cabbage on its own, no fire and no fuss involved. And that salted water becomes exactly the place the good bacteria already living on the cabbage want to multiply in, and it is the acid those bacteria make as they go that keeps the whole crock from turning on you. Too little salt, and instead of souring properly the way it should, it simply rots, and there is no saving it once that happens. Any shred of cabbage left poking up above the brine line will mold within days, plain and simple. My mother used to lift the cloth off her crock every few days without a word, just to look, the way you might check on a sleeping child without meaning to wake them, and I find myself doing the very same thing now in my own cellar corner, more years later than I care to count. The cellar holds the next stretch of what carries us through winter, and there is a rule down there I learned the hard way myself, before I ever learned it from my mother's own mouth. Potatoes want it cold, dark, and a little damp, somewhere near 40 to 50 degrees, and kept that way they simply sleep, refusing to sprout or shrivel for months on end without complaint. But apples and onions both give off a gas as they sit there, quietly, the same way they sit in your own kitchen bowl, and that gas pushes potatoes out of their sleep early, waking them when nobody wants them waking, which is the real reason, not some old superstition passed around for no good cause, that my mother always kept her apples in one corner of the cellar and her potatoes in another, never touching, never even close enough to share a shelf. Squash and cabbage heads get cured first in a warmer spot before ever going down into that cold, their skins toughening so they hold through the winter without going soft. And the apples themselves get wrapped one at a time in plain newspaper, set apart from everything else entirely, because one single bruised apple ripens faster than the rest of the barrel, and breathes out enough of that gas to age every fruit and vegetable anywhere near it. The older women of our district have a saying about checking your apple shelf once a week for the one going soft before it tells on itself to all the others, and I have come to believe there is real wisdom folded into that small, plain saying. Dried beans ask for little beyond patience, which is a kind of ingredient all its own. In a house with two small children pulling at you, get them fully dry, truly dry all the way through before you ever put them up in a jar, and they will sit on a shelf for years without trouble, because nothing that spoils food can take hold in something that dried to begin with. The danger is only ever in rushing that drying along. A bean that looks dry on the outside but is still holding damp at its very center will mold from the inside out, and you will not know a single thing about it until you open the jar months later and find it ruined. My children think shelling beans together on the porch in late summer is some kind of a game, and they help a good deal, less than they believe they do, but I would not trade that slow hour with them for anything the store could offer me instead. Corn I keep whole as long as I possibly can, grinding only what we need for that particular week, because the oil sitting inside the kernel's germ has not yet been exposed to open air, and it is that exposure, once it starts, that begins the clock running toward rancidity. A big sack of meal bought already ground, the kind the English buy in bulk to spare themselves an extra trip into town, will turn rancid or draw weevils long before the sack is ever used up. My mother's hand grinder still sits by our own back door to this day, and it gets a cupful at a time, never the whole sack at once, no matter how much faster that might seem. Honey hardly needs a method at all, and that still strikes me even now as something close to a small wonder. It carries so much of its own sugar that it pulls the water straight out of any mold spore or stray bit of bacteria that happens to land in it. And something that dry on the inside simply cannot spoil, not ever, not really. Keep it sealed away from added moisture, and that is the whole of the work required of you. It may crystallize with time, turning cloudy and stiff in the jar, but that is not spoiling at all. Only sugar doing what sugar naturally does on its own. And a gentle bath, in warm water, never the high heat of a microwave, brings it right back to liquid without any harm done. My mother once ate a spoonful straight from a jar 2 summers old, right in front of me, just to prove her point without saying a single word about it. Maple syrup and the molasses we boil down from sorghum work on that very same principle. The sugar concentrated high enough through slow boiling that it resists spoiling entirely on its own merit. Boil it too thin, rushing the batch along, and it will ferment right there in the sealed jar before you ever get to use it. Boil it too far past where it should stop, and it hardens into something closer to candy than syrup, pretty to look at, but not what you set out to make. There is a smell that hangs around the sugar house in the last cold weeks of winter that I have never managed to describe properly to anyone who has not stood inside it themselves, and it is the one sweet thing my own children are allowed before supper, and they know it, and they wait for it every single year without my having to remind them. Lard is where my mother's voice gets sternest in my memory, sterner than almost anywhere else in the kitchen. Rendering it right means melting the fat away from the meat and the tissue around it slowly. Low heat the whole time through, never rushed, and straining it clean through cloth before it ever goes into a crock to set. The water that tissue once held leaves right along with everything else in that straining, and fat with no water left inside it gives spoiling almost nothing to work with. But leave even a small scrap of meat behind in that strain, even one you cannot quite see, and it will turn, and it will take the whole crock down with it, every bit of it ruined for the sake of one careless pass through the cloth. Done right, a crock kept on the coldest shelf in the cellar will carry us a full year past butchering, spoonful by spoonful, against shortening and cooking oil bought new at the store every few weeks of the year. Bacon and ham ask for the most respect of anything I do in my whole kitchen, and I say that without any exaggeration at all. Salt pulls the water out of the meat itself, plain osmosis, nothing more mysterious than that simple movement, and the smoke that follows afterward lays down compounds across the surface that slow spoiling further still, the two of them working together rather than apart. But a thick cut, salted in a hurry or cured too short a time for its size, can spoil from the inside while looking perfectly fine to the eye from the outside. And that is not a small mistake with a small consequence attached to it. My grandmother always pressed a finger firmly into the thickest part of a ham before she would trust it was cured all the way through to the bone. And I do the very same thing myself to this day, every single time, without skipping it once. Canned meat and sausage are where I will be plainest of all with you, because this is the one place in my whole kitchen where there is no room left over for guessing at anything. A pressure canner reaches a heat that a simple water bath cannot ever touch. Hot enough to destroy the kind of stubborn spore that survives ordinary boiling altogether. And that is the entire reason behind every warning you have ever heard whispered about home canning meat gone wrong. Pack the jars correctly. Run the pressure and the time the jar size calls for, not a minute less, and there is nothing at all to fear in it. Guess at it instead, or shortcut it because you're tired or in a hurry, and you are gambling with something far worse than a ruined dinner on the table. The hiss of that canner on butchering day is a sound I still listen for without quite meaning to, the same way you might listen for your own name called across a crowded room. Onions finish out the cellar's work for the year. Cured properly, their necks dried tight and papery before ever coming inside. Hung where the air can move freely all around them, they resist rot on their own through the whole winter without any further help from me. Pack them instead into a closed bin, or worse still, a plastic bag meant to be airtight. And they sweat from the inside out, rotting quietly while the skin still looks perfectly fine to the eye, which fools more people than you would ever think possible until it happens to them. My mother braided hers and hung the rope by the cellar stairs herself, twisting it a little tighter each fall, so they could breathe, as she always put it, plain as that. And then there is the one I have saved for the very last, because it is the one that still makes the English blink at me when I describe it plainly across a fence or a kitchen table. And it is the one my own mother kept furthest back in the cellar, under the stairs, where my children were warned off of it when they were smaller, told there was something in there best left alone, when really it only ever held next April's eggs, nothing more frightening than that. Pickling lime, mixed at 1 ounce to every quart of water, makes a solution so alkaline that nothing harmful can ever establish itself inside it. And that same solution physically seals the countless tiny pores scattered across an eggshell, the very thing the egg's own natural bloom does for it the day it is first laid, before anyone has touched it at all. You take eggs straight from the henhouse, unwashed, that bloom still whole and unbroken on the shell, and set them point down into a crock, the way you might set them into a carton, then pour the lime water over until every single egg sits fully under it with nothing exposed to open air. Cover the crock loosely to slow the evaporation, and set the whole thing somewhere cool and dark to wait out the months ahead. That is all there is to it. Nothing more complicated than that, and nothing at all that needs electricity or a freezer humming away in the background. But it will only ever work with eggs that still carry their bloom, which means it will never work with anything bought at a store, because that bloom is scrubbed and bleached away from every egg the English sell on a shelf, washed clean for looks rather than for keeping. And a lime solution poured over a washed egg has nothing left on it to seal against. Done with the right eggs, kept the right way, they will stay good raw for 8 months, sometimes a full 12, carrying a household clean through the very stretch of winter when the hens slow their laying down to almost nothing at all. A cracked shell ruins that one egg, and sometimes the whole jar around it. So I am careful every single time, the way my own mother taught me to be careful with it. I crack one open into a bowl most every spring, just to prove to my own children that it still smells and looks and cooks exactly the way it did the very day it went down into that crock. And every single year their faces tell me they still cannot quite believe it, no matter how many times they have watched me do it before. There are smaller things too, ones that hardly need their own telling at length. Butter packed tight into a crock under its own brine, with no air left trapped anywhere inside it, will outlast churning day by months without turning. The end of a cheese wheel, sealed all over in melted wax, once it has gone fully cool, will keep for months where it would otherwise spoil within days of being cut. Herbs hung in small bundles up in the attic rafters, well away from the steam rising off the kitchen below. dry fast in that dry, still heat without losing the oils that give them their flavor in the first place. And a small cloth bag of salt, or even a handful of plain dry rice, tucked down into the cornmeal tin, will pull stray moisture out of the air trapped inside it and keep the meal from clumping or drawing weevils for nearly as long as the corn itself would otherwise keep on its own. I think about all of this sometimes while I am standing at the cellar shelves, with one child pulling at my apron and the other asking, again, why the eggs are kept under the stairs where nobody is supposed to look. And what strikes me every time is that none of it ever disappeared from ordinary kitchens because it stopped working. It disappeared because it became easier at some point along the way for whole households to simply buy instead of keep. And a generation grew up never needing to be shown what their own grandmothers knew without ever having to be taught it in so many words. Nobody set out to lose it on purpose. It is only what happens quietly when a thing becomes easy enough to skip. The crock under my cellar stairs does not know any of that. It does not know it is old-fashioned, and it would not care if it did. It is only doing quietly what it has always done, waiting there in the dark for whoever happens to be paying attention to notice.